wonderful stories from the book of Genesis. And I think you just discovered why it might be a good idea if you have time to read ahead before you show up on Sunday morning so you'll know what's going on. We've come a long way since last week. Last week, remember, Abraham was saved from having to sacrifice his son, his only son Isaac, whom he loved. At that point, Isaac was just a boy, maybe 8 or 10 years old. Since then, his mom, Sarah, has died and been buried. And now Isaac is 40 years old, and it's time for him to get married. He has to get married. He doesn't have a choice. He must get married. The fate of the world depends on it. Here's what I mean. God's plan for the salvation of the world involves choosing this people, calling these people to be God's own people, drawing them close to his heart. They will be the people who know God's ways and who live God's ways. And through them, eventually, all the nations of the earth will be able to see what it's like to be God's people. And they will turn and they will enjoy themselves the blessings of being God's people. That's what God has chosen this family to do. As God reminds Abraham more than once in these stories, he says, I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to make you a great nation, and your offspring are going to be more numerous than the stars of heaven. And through your offspring, all the nations of the earth will receive blessings for themselves. That's God's plan through Abraham for the world. Now, did you hear that crucial word in there? Offspring. If Abraham's going to become a great nation, and if this great nation is eventually going to bless all the other nations of the world, then Abraham is going to need offspring. He's going to need descendants, and he's going to need a lot of them. And so, Isaac has to get married. And that brings us to today's story. Abraham sends his servant off to find a wife for his son Isaac. He says, go, the Lord is going to go ahead of you, will make your way successful. And so the servant sets out. And on his way, he says, here's what I'm going to do. When I see a woman at the watering hole, I'm going to say, can I have a drink from your water jar? And if she says, sure, and I will water your camels as well, then I know that she's the one the Lord has chosen. And so that's exactly what the servant does. He goes to the watering hole. Rebecca comes out and he says, can I have a drink from your water jar? How's that for pickup line? Can I have a drink from your water jar? She says, sure, and let me water your camels as well. He says, bingo, she's the one. Can I talk to your people? I need to talk to your people. So she takes him back and he gathers with her family and her dad and her brother. And he says, look, here's what's happened. I was on my way here to find a wife for my master's son Isaac, and I said, I'm going to say this to the girl, and if she says this, I'll know she's the one. And I said this, and she said this, and so she must be the one. My journey is successful. If you'll just let me take the girl, I'll be on my way. And the dad and the brother say, clearly God's involved in this. Have the girl. And by the end of the chapter, Isaac is taking Rebekah into his tent. And as you'll see next week, there are offspring. The story can go on. The plan can continue. God has provided. God has provided. God's providence. Providence. That is the word that hovers over this story in Genesis. It's the word that hovers over the whole of Genesis. It's the word that hovers over the whole Bible. God's providence. Now, usually when we think of providence, we think that means God's in charge. God is in control. What do you think of when you hear the word providence? How do you feel when someone tells you, God is provident? Don't worry, God is in charge. God is in control. Now, my guess is there are some circumstances when many of us chafe under the idea of God's providence. Because we think that butts up against our own freedom. If God is provident, if God is in charge and in control, what about my decisions for my own life? If God is provident, then am I free? Tomorrow is Independence Day. We like our independence. And wouldn't want a God who would mess with that. It's the day we celebrate our freedom. And we think, if God is provident, what does this mean for my freedom? In March of 2009, Time Magazine had a cover article. The title of the story was 10 Ideas That Are Changing the World Right Now. And one of those ideas, the article called The New Calvinism. Now, John Calvin was a Christian reformer in the 16th century. And he's known most famously for his understanding of God's providence, of God's sovereignty, and especially of predestination, this notion that God is so in charge, God has chosen that some people would be saved and some people would be damned, and our wills don't have anything to do with it. Now, this article is claiming that in America today, Calvinism, or the New Calvinism, is resurging with a kind of vengeance. It's coming back. Many of the most popular Christian speakers and popular Christian books that you even buy in Walmart are written by people who are a part of this New Calvinism. And here's how the article describes New Calvinism's God. It says, this is an absolutely sovereign deity who micromanages the world's affairs. It says this is a rock-steady deity who orchestrates absolutely everything, even illness and home foreclosure, exclamation point. And this is where we're supposed to get a picture of God, kind of looking like Albus Dumbledore in Harry Potter, with the long white beard, only he's got strings tied to his fingers, right? Going down to marionette puppets, pulling the strings, and on the end of the strings are you and I. Puppets in the hand of a provident God. You figured out I don't agree with this. But I wonder, as you read these stories, is this really the picture of providence you get as you're going through these stories in Genesis? Think again of last week's story. Abraham is told to go up and sacrifice his son Isaac. And he chooses to do this, to obey God's command. And when he gets there and is about to sacrifice his son, an angel stops him. And they find a ram in the pit. And so he sacrifices the ram instead of his son. At that moment, Abraham names this place, God will provide. God will provide. God's providence in this situation isn't pulling the strings on Abraham. He's no puppet. He's a full, free human agent in the story. That's what makes it interesting. We wouldn't read it if he were a puppet. The fact that Abraham chooses to do this is what gives the story its tension and its power. God isn't provident because he's pulling the strings. God is provident because he provided in the end. God provided a way for his plan to continue. If Isaac dies, there are no offspring. There are no descendants. There's no great nation, and then there's no way the rest of the world will be blessed. But God provided. The Hebrew word here for will provide also means God will see. God will see. And I think that's a great translation. God will see to it. This is the place where God will see to it. And our word provide comes from the Latin word provideo, which also means to see to it. God will see to it. That's what God is doing in these stories. God is seeing to it that God's plan can be continued. And these people have what they need to go on. And I think that's something like the picture of providence in this story about God providing a wife for Isaac. In this story, God's not a puppeteering, maneuvering, micromanaging, orchestrating deity. But God is provident, working with full, free human agents. I mean, look at Rebecca here. She is in a patriarchal culture. A culture where the men decide everything. And these men have decided that God is provident and God has chosen her. But then her brother and her mother say, let her stay with us at least 10 more days. And Abraham's servant says, look, don't delay me. The Lord has made my journey successful. He's acknowledging God is provident, God is in charge. And they say, which might be the most countercultural thing in the whole book of Genesis, they say, let's ask the girl. Let's acknowledge her freedom. She is an agent in this story. She has a will. Let's ask her. And so in asking Rebecca what she wants to do, Rebecca decides to participate and cooperate with God's providence. She says, I will. I will go. God is in charge, but Rebecca's kind of in charge too, right? God is provident, but Rebecca's no puppet here. God is sovereign, but she is clearly free. Here you have God's providence and human freedom in the story right next to one another. No contradiction, but no explanation either. This is just how it is. All right, back to today. Where in the world is the good news for us in this whole story? I wonder, isn't it in the fact that when God gives his people a purpose, a mission, a task to accomplish, that God will see to it they have what they need to fulfill the task, the mission, the purpose. And that we are invited to participate in God's providence as free people like Rebecca. It doesn't get better than that. God provides and we participate. What good news. A few years ago, my wife and I were co-pastors of a small church in northern Franklin County, North Carolina, not far from Henderson. And this was and still is an economically depressed area even before the plummet of 2008. And we've been studying these stories in Abraham and reading about what it means to be God's family. And the people of the church began to say, you know, we're part of this family, right? I mean, Jesus has invited us into this family. We've experienced God's blessings. So maybe we're called somehow to bless those people around us as well. And so some folks in the church said, maybe we could have a food pantry right out of our church so that our neighbors don't have to drive all the way into town, but they can come right here and be provided for. And so that's what we did. And the fourth Saturday of every month, we opened the back doors of the church and we gave out food to 15 or 20 or 30 families. And it was a huge success except for one problem. By that Saturday afternoon, the food pantry was absolutely bare. The cupboard was bare. Not a box of cereal, not a bag of Utz chips. We had a lot of Utz chips. There was an Utz chip driver in the church. We had a lot of chips. Not a jar of pickles. Absolutely bare. And this is when the panic set in. The next Sunday morning, we heard people say, there will never be enough. We can't do this again. How in the world will we come up with enough food in the next 3 or 4 weeks to feed 20 families? And then they remind us, don't you know that most of the folks in this church are on a fixed income? They're retired and on Social Security. They hardly have enough money to buy food for themselves, let alone for the rest of the county. We'll never be able to do it. And after 1 week, there was no food. And after 2 weeks, there was no food. After 3 weeks, there was no food. And then the fourth Saturday would come and Ginger and I would wake up and we'd get the boys and we'd walk across the 30-yard field over to the church. And invariably there were cars lined up. And Carol and Mandy were there, carrying out boxes of food and putting them in trunks. Food for 15 or 20 or 30 families. And we'd say, where did this food come from? Well, God provided. And so Rebecca showed up and said, I will. When God gives a mission, a purpose, a task, we trust God will provide what we need to fulfill the mission, purpose, task, and we are invited to be Rebecca's participating in God's providence. Now, aren't we his family too? Haven't you and I been invited into this family that's close to God? Haven't we experienced the blessings of being God's people? And so we share the same mission to let these blessings spill out to our community and to our neighbors. And that's why when someone like Faith stands up and says, we need some more donations, and we need some more people to help with Vacation Bible School if we're going to bless these children in our church and our community, that's why I relax. And I say, well, if God has called us to this, God will provide. But some Rebecca's better show up and say, I will. That's why when Roger Lloyd sends an email the week before homeless families come and stay in our church, and he says, the homeless families are coming and we're going to provide hospitality, but we need some people to spend the night with them on Thursday and some people to feed them on Tuesday. I relax. You might get nervous when I relax. I relax and say, if God has called us to this, and God clearly has, then God will provide. And then I think, but some Rebeccas better show up and say, I will. And more often than not, Roger is one of those Rebeccas. When God has called us to a ministry, a task, a purpose, we trust that God will provide, and we're given the gift of participating in God's providence. Now, we don't see God's providence, God's providing anywhere more clearly than we do when we gather right here at this table on Sunday mornings. At this place where we have found ourselves invited into the family. We have found ourselves God's people, close to God's heart, invited to live God's ways. Because a Rebecca named Jesus Christ a long time ago said, I will. I will provide. I will offer my own self so that all these people of the world can know the blessings of God's life, of God's abundant life. And so here at this table, we enjoy God's providence, God's provision for us. And so having been provided for, let us stand and leave this table as agents of God's provision in the world, with Rebecca's I will springing from our lips. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.